Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology, Chapter 2. We are going to jump right in. This is Anatomy and Physiology, Chapter 2. So, this chapter is really a big chapter discussing chemistry. And it's important for us to understand basic chemistry and understand the levels of organization that deal with us as living organisms. Chemistry is going to be helpful for helping us to educate our patients on how to choose healthy diet, how to use their medications properly, how to evaluate any health fads that may be out there in social media. Also, it will help us to help our patients understand their medical treatments and procedures. So the learning outcomes for this chapter is going to be recognizing elements that are within the human body. These elements come from the periodic table of elements. We're going to be able to distinguish between elements and compounds, the importance of minerals in the body, and we'll talk about ions, electrolytes, a little bit, free radicals, and we'll look at types of chemical bonds and reactions. So let's talk about what is an element. So a chemical element is a simple form of matter with unique chemical properties. If you refer to the periodic table of elements, you will note that we have 118 different unique elements. And so when we break things down into their elements, for example, water, which consists of hydrogen and oxygen, each of those, hydrogen and oxygen, they each have their own particular unique properties. So there are elements in the body, and there's about 91 naturally occurring elements on Earth, and 24 of them have normal roles in humans. Now, the other elements that don't necessarily occur naturally or in nature are usually synthesized or made by scientists. So 6% of these elements make up 98% of the body's weight. So again, 24 of these elements from the periodic table of the elements really have an important part in human life. Okay, so those six that we need to know make up the body's weight, 98.5% is oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. And some of you probably recognize that, well, yes, we breathe in oxygen in order to survive. You may think, yes, we need calcium and phosphorus to keep our bones strong. Right, so we do need these six as they make up 98.5% of our body weight. And this is a great little table if you're a visual learner and you like to look at tables. This table shows you not only the name of those six elements, those major elements, but it also gives you the symbol. On the periodic table of elements, usually the element is represented by a capital letter, sometimes a capital letter and a lowercase letter, as is in the case with calcium. And this breaks down the percentage of the body weight. And so oxygen is 65% of our body weight, which is quite amazing. Now, here's some other elements that are lesser in their percentage of our body weight, but they are still essential for survival and healthy survival. So we have sulfur, potassium, sodium, chlorine, magnesium, and iron. We also have trace elements within the human body, and these are needed in a very, very small amount, but they're still important. And that consists of chromium, cobalt, copper, fluorine, iodine, manganese, molybdenum, selenium, and silicon, tin, vanadium, and zinc. So these are called trace elements. So these minerals, they are inorganic and they can be extracted from the soil by plants. They're passed up the food chain to humans. And these minerals are 4% of the body weight. And many of them are calcium and phosphorus. And these minerals help with our body structure. For example, our bones and our teeth, and they help to make up proteins. So minerals are important. Now, electrolytes are salts that actually break down water and they help to actually conduct electricity. So this is important because when we think about these electrolytes, they help with chemical reactions that take place in the body. And as we learned in chapter 1, the body is continually going through changes to try to maintain homeostasis. Some of those changes are chemical reactions that are taking place. So it's really important when we think about electrolytes to know that electrolytes need to be kept in a normal range in order for our patients to be healthy. So, molecules and chemical bonds. When we think about molecules, they are made up of two or more atoms and they are united by a covalent chemical bond. This means that they are actually sharing valence electrons. So atoms may be identical or different elements in these molecules. An example is given is oxygen, which and it says O2. That means two uh, two atoms of oxygen will bond together to make O2. Another example of a molecule is CO2. That's one carbon for every two oxygen. Now, a compound is a molecule that is made up of two different elements. Okay, so a compound could be CO2 because it's made up of carbon and it's made up of oxygen. But O2 is not considered a compound, it is only a molecule because it is only made up of the element of oxygen. Now, chemical bonds, we just mentioned covalent bonds in the previous slide. Chemical bonds are the forces that hold atoms and molecules together. So when we think about chemical bonds, the covalent bonds help those um, atoms stay together by sharing valence or outer electrons. Now, ionic bonds are attraction between a cation and an anion. So we have an attraction between a negative and a positive element. So here we have sodium, which is Na, which is positive, and Cl, which is negative. And that may actually, if you put NaCl together, it forms sodium chloride. And this is an ionic bond because one is positive, one is negative. Now, the thing with these ionic bonds is that they are weak and they will break easily if the ions are attracted to something else. Okay, so for example, they break easily in water. Now remember, our covalent bonds, they actually share electrons, and it is a strong bond. When we think about covalent bonds, they can be single or they could be double. And so looking at this, it tells us that single covalent bonds, they share a single pair of electrons. And an example of this would be hydrogen, and that's symbolized by H2. So two hydrogen are sharing a single pair of electrons. A double covalent bond shows two pairs of electrons being shared. And in this case, we have carbon dioxide. The two lines that you see are symbolizing the double bond. So covalent bonds are stronger bonds, and they're single covalent bonds as well as double covalent bonds. Now, non-covalent bonds, or I'm sorry, non-polar covalent bonds, they share electrons, and the electrons spend the same amount of time around each nucleus. So there is no charge, there's no net charge. And an example of this is the bond between carbon atoms, and the symbol for carbon is C. Now, polar covalent bonds occur in water, and that's when those shared electrons spend more time around one nucleus. And an example of this is H2O. Two hydrogen for every one oxygen, that forms a polar covalent bond. Okay. Now, hydrogen bond, this is between a slightly positive hydrogen ion and a slightly negative oxygen or nitrogen atom. Okay. So a hydrogen bond again is between a slightly positive hydrogen atom and a slightly negative oxygen or nitrogen atom. So the hydrogen bond is the weakest of all bonds. An example of this is going to be the bond between water molecules. Okay. So again, this is your hydrogen bond. Okay, this is a great table if you are a visual learner that kind of breaks down the different bonds. You have ionic bonds, covalent bonds, as well as the hydrogen bond. The ionic bond is relatively weak. It's a positive and a negative that are attracted to each other, but it's easily disrupted in water. Covalent bonds are the strongest of them all, and we can share one pair of electrons. That'll be a single covalent bond, or two electron pairs can be shared, that is double covalent bond. And we also have nonpolar and polar covalent, and that tells about the attraction of the electrons and which atoms they spend the most time in the valence shell. Okay, so nonpolar, they actually are equally attracted to both of the atoms, and polar covalent is that they are more attracted to one than the other. Now, hydrogen bonds are those weak bonds that you see in the water molecule. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about water a little bit more. So water is amazing. It's essential for survival in all life forms, and it is a versatile solvent, meaning that it is able to dissolve solutes. Okay, it can dissolve more solutes that and than any other substance. So if I was to make lemonade and use powder, the solute would be the powder and water would be the solvent. And so water is really ideal for transporting chemicals throughout the body, and it's really important for fostering chemical reactions in the body. When we think about water, we need to think about hydrophilic and hydrophobic. So breaking these words down, hydro means water, philic means loving, and phobic means fearing. So hydrophilic substances, they are substances that dissolve in water, and examples of those are salts and sugars. Hydrophobic substances do not dissolve in water. Again, hydrophobic is water fearing, and an example of that is fats. Okay, so hydrophilic, they dissolve in water. Hydrophobic, they are not able to dissolve in water. So when we think about the unique properties of water, sorry about that, we think about adhesion and cohesion. So adhesion is the tendency to cling to surfaces. So we use tissue membranes as an example. And it's important because it makes a good lubricant because it reduces friction. An example of that is in the joints. You don't want to have a lot of friction in the joints because then the patient will be experiencing pain. Now, the other principle of water or property of water is that it has cohesion. And so that means there's water molecules that are attracted to each other. And it accounts for water's thermal stability. Okay, so maintaining a temperature, a regular temperature. Now, when we think about this thermal stability of water, it has a resistance to temperature changes, which is important because much of our body is made up of water. So this helps us to stabilize our body temperature, and it also serves as an effective coolant. When we become hot, our body will actually produce sweat, and that cools the body by a process called evaporative cooling. When we think about water, it's important to define what a calorie is. A calorie is also abbreviated as CAL, And this is the amount of heat that raises 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. That is a calorie. You probably think about a calorie if you're at the gym on the treadmill or on the elliptical, and it says, okay, you have burned 250 calories or 500 calories in this workout today. Okay, so again, that is another use of calorie. And again, calorie is heat that raises 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. Now, a kilocalorie, kilo is, think of 1,000. So this is abbreviated kcal, and that's a dietary calorie. A lot of times you will see the menus now at fast food and at restaurants, they will have the amount of calories per food item or per meal. So if you go to McDonald's, it may say that this Big Mac meal is 1,300 calories. Now that's a lot of calories because typical calorie allotment for a human adult is about 2,000 to 3,000 calories, depending on if you're male or female. So that one meal has a lot of calories. Okay, so let's talk about acids and bases, and then we'll continue with pH. So when we think about an acid, this is some molecule that is releasing a proton in the water. Okay, and you may think, well, yes, okay, acid. I know acid because our stomach is full of acid. Your stomach is nothing more than a muscular bag of hydrochloric acid, right? So that's when we think of acids. We may think of citric acid. Now, a base is a proton acceptor. So your acid is a proton donor, but the base is a proton acceptor. And so bases also, in many cases, they release hydroxides, which is your OH. So other examples of bases is NH3 and NaOH, right, which is sodium hydroxide. Okay, let's talk about pH. pH is known as the power of hydrogen. Okay, and again, we're thinking about this concentration of hydrogen. So we think about the pH scale, it goes from 0 to 14. Now, if something has a pH of 7, that means it is neutral, meaning that it is not acidic and it is not basic. If something has a pH of 0 to 7, or really, 6-ish, then it is acidic. Okay, if something has a pH that is greater than 7, it is known as basic or alkaline. Okay, why is that important? Okay, why is that important? Well, let's take a look at these different pHs for a moment, and then we'll talk about why understanding the concept of pH is important. So here we have pure water, which is neutral. It has a pH of 7. It's right in the middle. And let's take a look at the things that are acidic. So we have hydrochloric acid in the stomach. And so that's important to note because if I was to have a patient who's on an NG tube, nasogastric tube, and I test the contents of that nasogastric tube, I should expect something acidic because the NG tube goes from the patient's nose to their stomach and it's pulling out acid. So if that NG tube is nasogastric tube is still in the stomach, the contents when I test it will be acidic and it will give you a pH of between 1 to 4. Okay. Lemon juice is acidic. Wine, vinegar, bananas, tomatoes are all acidic. Black coffee, bread is acidic. Now, milk is also slightly acidic. Let's look at what's basic. So egg whites, household bleach, ammonia, dishwashing liquid or dish soap, oven cleaner, those are all things that are basic. Now, let's take a closer look at why understanding pH is different. So in chapter 1, we talked about the body trying to maintain homeostasis. Now, pH is important because if the body doesn't have the normal pH of 7.35 to 7.45, right, that's the pH you'll find in blood. If we don't have that normal pH, that is going to be problematic for your patient's health. Okay, so when we think about pH disturbances, they are very disruptive to the physiology or the functions of our organs. So if a human's blood becomes very acidic, that is a problem. If it becomes very basic, that is a problem. So what kind of symptoms would a patient exhibit if their blood pH is not within normal range? Well, they may have tremors, fainting, paralysis, or even death. When you get to your medical surgical classes, you will spend probably an entire lecture talking about acid-base balance. That is a huge concept to understand. So try to understand this concept now because you will see it again applied to the care of your patient. Buffers are chemical solutions that resist changes in pH. Okay, so it's important to understand that buffers are chemical solutions that resist changes in pH. So let's talk about organic compounds for just a moment. When we think about organic chemistry, we're thinking about the chemistry of carbon. Carbon is amazing because it can bind to each carbon, it can bind to itself, it can make chains, branches, rings, and carbon can bind to hydrogen, to oxygen, nitrogen, as well as other elements. And biochemistry is important because it helps us understand life's processes. So other organic compounds that we need to be aware of are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So let's talk about some macromolecules. And in the name, macro means large. So these are large molecules. Okay, and so polymers, these are molecules made up of a series of similar or identical subunits, and those subunits are called monomers. So why is this important? Well, and for an example, starch is a polymer. It consists of glucose monomers. So this is really important because as we patients ingest food, as humans ingest food, we are getting those polymers and the body has to break it down. The digestive system has to break it down into monomers and even smaller so the body can use that food, that starch, right, as fuel for the body. Okay, so speaking of carbohydrates, carbohydrates includes starches, sugars, and glycogen. And this is an example of the formula for glucose. So for every glucose molecule, there's 6 carbon, there's 12 hydrogen, and 6 oxygen. Okay, now your carbohydrates are hydrophilic. That means they are water loving. Let's break our carbohydrates down and let's talk about monosaccharides. Mono meaning one kinds of sugar. So monosaccharides are the simplest carbohydrates. And the 3 most important are isomers. So meaning that they all have the same formula, but the way that they bond or link up is different. So these isomers are glucose, fructose, and galactose. Now, glucose is commonly called blood sugar. So when you go to clinical, you will take your patient's blood sugar and you're going to be looking at their levels of glucose. Normal glucose is between about 70 and 105, 110. Okay. Now, the patient can get glucose, right, or get these complex carbohydrates and monosaccharides by ingesting more, okay, ingesting more complex carbohydrates. So the monosaccharides will be broken down by the body. So that's the important part. So again, simplest carbohydrates are these monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, and galactose. And then how can a person gain more of these? By getting complex carbohydrates. Now, disaccharides are 2 monosaccharides that are bonded together. So there's 3 most important disaccharides, which are sucrose, lactose, and maltose. So sucrose is common table sugar, and hey, look at it. It is composed of glucose and fructose. Now, lactose is glucose and galactose. You may be familiar with lactose if you are lactose intolerant. This is the sugar that actually is present in milk. Now, maltose is glucose and glucose, and this is a product of starch digestion. Polysaccharides, poly meaning many. So these are polymers of glucose. So the most important ones are glycogen, starch, and cellulose. Now, glycogen is long energy storage. It's made by the liver. I'm sorry, glycogen, rather. Glycogen is long branched energy storage polysaccharide. It's made by the liver and it's stored in the liver when blood glucose is high and it's broken down between meals to increase glucose. Okay, so glycogen. Let's take a look at starch. Starch is energy storage polysaccharide in plants. Okay, and then cellulose is a structural polysaccharide of plants. It is indigestible to us and it provides dietary fiber. And so we do need this dietary fiber. So if you take a big chomping bite of celery, you're going to get some cellulose. And that's going to help you to promote movement of those foods and other particles through your intestines. It will help with passing of stool. Okay? So what is the job of carbohydrates? Well, carbohydrates are important because they're a source of energy that can be quickly mobilized in the body, especially if your patient is a diabetic patient. For example, they have what we call hypoglycemia. They have low blood sugars. Now, sometimes these carbohydrates can bond to proteins and lipids, and they form the components of other parts of the body. For example, mucus, tissue gel, cell membranes, they all are made up of components of carbohydrates. Cartilage and lubricating joints, the lubricating fluid in joints, again, carbohydrates help with that. Okay, all right, let's talk about lipids. So lipids are hydrophobic as carbohydrates were hydrophilic, lipids are hydrophobic, water-fearing. So lipids include our triglycerides, which are fats and oils, phospholipids, steroids, cholesterol, estrogen, testosterone. So lipids are only usually composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So there is a higher ratio of hydrogen to oxygen than that lies within carbohydrates. And there's more calories per gram than carbohydrates. So lipids are those fats, those tasty desserts, right? They're high in lipids. Okay, so let's talk about triglycerides. Okay, so fats are solid at room temperature. And oils, if are called oils if they are liquid at room temperature. So an example of that would be lard, or maybe your shortening. That would be a fat, right? And that's a solid at room temperature. But olive oil is a liquid at room temperature. Now, these triglycerides, they are built by a process that is called dehydration synthesis. When you think about synthesis, we are putting things together to build something new. Now, the two components that build triglycerides are glycerols and fatty acids. Okay, glycerols and fatty acids. Now, when we think about fatty acids, they are saturated or unsaturated. So a saturated fatty acid contains as much hydrogen as it can carry. Okay. Now an unsaturated fatty acid has extra hydrogens that can be added because of the double carbon bonds. Okay. Polyunsaturated fatty acids, they have multiple double carbon bonds. Okay, so it's all about the chemical bonds when we think about the differences between saturated and unsaturated fats. Okay, so let's talk about now the types of, oh wait, triglycerides. So there's saturated and unsaturated as well. Okay. And so the important thing to note with triglycerides is they function in energy storage. They help for insulation and they cushion vital organs. So every single human needs a certain amount of fat or adipose tissue. It's important to have, if someone's BMI or body mass index goes to below a certain level, that becomes concerning because everyone needs a certain amount of fat. Now, it's better for patients to get their fats from things like omega-3s, like fish oils, right? Rather than getting their fats from French fries and cheeseburgers, okay? So let's look at phospholipids now. So phospholipids are similar to triglycerides, but they have a phosphate group that's in place of one fatty acid, okay? And that's why they're called phospholipids. They have a hydrophobic head and a hydrophilic tail. Remember, hydrophobic is water-fearing, hydrophilic is water-loving, okay? And the term amphipathic is meaning that something is partly attracted to water and partly repelled by water. Now, phospholipids are important because they are the structural foundation of cell membranes. And we're going to get all into the cell in chapter 3. Okay, so phospholipids. So you'll see that again, and you'll remember that we'll call the cell membrane a phospholipid bilayer, 2 layers of phospholipids. Okay, let's talk about steroids. Steroids, they are lipids with carbon arranged in rings. Okay, and all steroids are synthesized from cholesterol. Okay, and cholesterol production, this is a quick sidebar, really happens most at night. So that's why patients with high cholesterol are advised to take their cholesterol medication at night. So examples of steroids are cortisol, progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone. So they differ in location of the carbon double bonds, and they differ in which groups are attached. So cholesterol, 85% is synthesized by the body, and the rest of it comes from animal products in our diet. So cholesterols are important because they help with other necessary steroids. But when we have elevated levels of cholesterol, it can have a negative impact by giving the patient cardiovascular disease, clogging those arteries, which is a condition that is known as atherosclerosis. Those arteries can become filled with these plaques. Okay. Let's talk about proteins now. So proteins are so important in the human body. When we think about proteins, they help to serve to give us structure. They help for communication. So example of when we think about proteins for structure, we're looking at keratin in the hair, the nails, the skin. We're looking at collagen in the bones, in the skin, in the teeth. Okay, proteins are also important because some hormones and hormone receptors are made of proteins. Proteins are also important because they are the key in membrane transport. They form channels that help things to go in and out of the cell if those things are too large to go through that phospholipid bilayer. Okay, and so proteins are also important because they help to form enzymes, and enzymes help to break things down. Okay, and so enzymes help to speed up these chemical reactions. Okay, so recognition and protection. Proteins are important because they help with immune recognition as well as the antibodies. Proteins are also important for movement, again, with the transporting items in and out of the cell. And proteins are important to help with the contraction of muscles. And proteins help with the adhesion for cells binding to other cells. Now let's talk about enzyme, which is a kind of protein, and it helps because it works as a biological catalyst. So this catalyst helps chemical reactions to take place, okay, in a more rapid fashion, if as if the enzymes were not present. The enzyme is not consumed or changed by this reaction, which is great. And the enzyme actually acts on a substrate. So every enzyme doesn't just act on any particular thing. They have one particular substance that they can actually act on. And so the enzyme will actually bind to that substance, and that is called a substrate enzyme complex. And sometimes it is known as the lock and key. So the enzyme itself has an active site, and these enzymes bind to specific substrates. And so it does fit in like a key fitting into a lock. And that's important because specific enzymes act on specific substrates. Okay, so the enzymes again are not changed by their reactions, and they can convert millions of substrates. So if you're a visual learner, this is a great picture of an enzymatic reaction that has 3 steps, and this is sometimes called the lock and key model. So here we have the enzyme and substrate, and these enzymes usually end in ASE, so ACE. So if I have the sugar sucrose, the enzyme that's going to bond with sucrose is sucrase. Okay? So this enzyme substrate complex is made with sucrose, which is the substrate. It binds at the active site of the enzyme, and the enzyme in this case is sucrase. So what happens? This enzyme speeds up the reaction, and the products are now made, glucose and fructose. And guess what? The enzyme sucrase is unchanged, and it can go on to the next molecule and do this again and again and again. Okay, so enzymes are important. Okay, now there are some things that could affect the ability of an enzyme to act, and that could be a change in temperature or a change in pH. Again, that's why it's important for the human body to maintain that normal pH. The pH of blood is 7.35 to 7.45. Memorize those numbers because, again, you will see them. Now, the optimum temperature for enzyme activity is between 37 to 40 degrees Celsius. Okay, now optimal pH is going to be different in different body regions. The blood, that's what I was focusing on. That's the value of 7.35 to 7.45. But remember, we talked about the stomach being a muscular sac full of hydrochloric acid. The optimum pH for the stomach is going to be 1 to 4, right, when we talk about that pH. So again, pH is something that could affect your enzyme activity as well as temperature. Okay. All right, nucleic acids. So these are organic polymers, and they are composed of nucleotides. For example, DNA, right, is made up of these nucleic acids as well as RNA. So DNA, you think about if you like crime, murder mysteries, we always talk about DNA, that deoxyribonucleic acid is left at the crime scene, right? Now the RNA is a ribonucleic acid, and it carries out the orders given by the DNA. So the DNA is the genetic code that programs everything, okay? And the DNA resides within the nucleus of the cell. So DNA is what we call a double helix, and it looks like a twisted ladder, okay? And this ladder, the vertical rails of it, are made of phosphate groups and then alternating deoxyribose, which is a sugar. So for you visual learners, this is a great visual of that double helix, that two-strand twisted molecule that looks like a staircase. Okay, so this is the structure of DNA. So the rungs of the ladder are made of pairs of nitrogenous bases in DNA, and we have some pairing going on. When we think about these bases, it is complementary pairing. So we have adenine that always pairs with thymine, and guanine always pairs with cytosine. So A binds with T and G binds with C. Okay, so if you remember that, I remember it by adenine and thymine. I just think of AT and T for some reason. And then guanine and cytosine because capital G is close to capital C. So I remember it that way. Now, this DNA is the foundation for our genetic function. Okay, so let's take a look now at RNA, ribonucleic acid. So there's different types of RNA. We won't necessarily focus on the three different types, but just know that they're smaller than DNA. They contain a sugar ribose instead of deoxyribose, and uracil is present instead of thymine. So in RNA, your adenine is going to bind with uracil instead of binding with thymine. And RNA functions mainly in the cytoplasm. And you're going to, when we talk about the cell, you're going to see RNA is present in your ribosomes. Okay. ATP. This is really important for you to understand. ATP, adenosine triphosphate. This is important. This is energy. Okay, energy. So ATP itself is a nucleotide. It has three components: adenine, which is a nitrogenous base, ribose, and it also has three phosphate groups, thus the name triphosphate. Tri means three. So adenosine triphosphate, also known as ATP. So the job of ATP is an energy transfer molecule. And so this occurs as synthesis reactions in our muscles when we have contractions. Okay. Um, Forms of energy to think about. Energy gives us the ability to do work. We have digesting starch, moving chemicals, building protein, circulating blood, contracting muscles. These are all examples of energy that we need in order to do this work. Okay. And so energy is the capacity to do work, to move matter, or to change in structure. And again, those are the examples that we see. Okay. Now we have different forms of energy. There is potential energy and kinetic energy. When I think of potential energy, that is energy that's stored, sometimes known as the energy of position as well. Energy is stored in our chemical bonds in food. So that's why the role of the digestive system is to break down that food that we eat into molecules that the body can use and absorb, right? And that is your potential energy. So an example here given is water backed up by a dam. Okay, that could flow through a turbine that will generate energy, right? And that is potential energy, energy of position. Now, kinetic energy is the energy of motion. So this is the electrical current when we turn on a flashlight. The heart actually contracts because of kinetic energy. Heat generated by our muscles, that is another example of kinetic energy. So let's talk about conversion of energy, because we have to sometimes convert that potential energy into kinetic energy. And that is done through chemical reactions. Okay, it's done through chemical reaction. An example of that could be muscle contraction. And when we do have this chemical reaction, we're going to probably produce some heat, okay? So heat is lost in every reaction, okay? And the heat is not able to do the work. So we will lose a bit of our energy through the release of heat. Now, we won't go deep into chemical reactions, but what you really need to know is a chemical reaction is a process in which the bonds are formed or broken between our molecules, or our atoms, our elements. So when we think about that covalent bond, sharing those valence electrons, or the ionic bond, which is a weak bond, there's something happening. There's either a breaking down or a building up with this chemical reaction. Now, the chemical reaction is symbolized by a chemical equation. So everything should add up. So if I have 5 carbon on the left side of my equation, I should have 5 carbon on the right side of my equation, because we know that energy can either be created or destroyed. Now, the distribution of those elements may be different. But we should still have the same number of elements as in the beginning and as at the end. Now, for this class, will you have to balance chemical equations? No. But in chemistry, that's one of the things that you may have seen in high school chemistry, or if you go on to take future chemistry classes, you will have to balance these equations. Okay, so let's talk about the 2 different types of reactions that you can see. Decomposition reactions, just like it sounds, things are broken down. So we have this equation AB. When it's broken down, it becomes A plus B. AB is one compound, one molecule that is broken down to A plus B. Okay, so it's individual components. So decomposition reaction, something's broken down. Synthesis reaction, we are building, we are synthesizing. So the A and the B that we had, when they go through this synthesis reaction, they are building, and it's no longer A plus B, we have AB as the product, okay? An example of this synthesis is building proteins from amino acids. All right, so this is a great picture if you are a visual learner. We think about the decomposition reaction, and we see the starch molecule being broken down. And then we have a synthesis reaction. We see these amino acids that are actually built up into a chain, forming a protein molecule. Okay, so decomposition and synthesis reactions. So we're going to be wrapping up this chapter by talking about metabolism, oxidation and reduction. So metabolism occurs when the body is performing its functions, right? And so when we look at catabolism and anabolism, catabolism is us releasing energy, right? Energy releasing through decomposition reactions, things being broken down. We're breaking down covalent bonds. We're producing smaller molecules from larger molecules. So those larger molecules are being broken down. Anabolism is we are synthesizing, we are building, okay? We are building, and that is the energy storing synthesis reaction that happens with anabolism, okay? Now, there's 2 different kinds of chemical reactions to be aware of. Exergonic reactions, so think release, exoskeleton, it's on the outside. So we are releasing energy. Endergonic reaction is we are taking in, so endo, right, is in. So reactions requiring input. Okay, and so an example of that would be producing proteins and fats. So exergonic, energy releasing, endergonic, energy requiring. Now there's oxidation reactions, and with this kind of reaction, it's a chemical reaction where electrons are given up by the molecule. And this process releases energy, and the molecule is what's called oxidized in this process, okay? So the releasing of this energy, of these electrons, is called oxidation. Now, the molecule that accepts these electrons is called the oxidizing agent, which is the electron acceptor. Many times, that molecule is oxygen, or element is oxygen. So when we think about it, an example is the rusting of iron. Iron is Fe, right? Well, that's the symbol, Fe. And when we oxidize, we have iron being rusted, turning the iron not just to Fe, but now it becomes FeO3. So for every atom or every element of iron, we have three oxygen. So for every one iron, we have three oxygen. Okay, reduction reactions. This is another type of chemical reaction. And what happens is there's gaining of electrons by a molecule. Okay, the molecule gains energy and it is reduced by this process. So the molecule that donates the electrons is termed the reducing agent, the electron donor. And what happens is they're always paired with oxidation of another molecule. So in chemistry, we see oxidation reduction reactions. Because you have one, then you'll get the other. That's just how it works. For this class, you don't have to necessarily balance those equations, but just know that they're paired together. And this concludes our discussion of Chapter 2. Remember, always think like a nurse.